Okay.
All set?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good evening and welcome to the RowanSOM Alumni Association monthly webinar series. I am Tom Cavalieri, Dean of Rowan University School of Osteopathic Medicine, and we're glad you could join us this evening for our program. Every pixel tells a story, staying human in a digital world. We are looking forward to an informative and enlightening conversation about the art of narrative medicine and staying connected with your patients, a topic area that I believe takes on new significance during this pandemic. The format of this webinar series will include presentations and a Q&A, all within 1 hour. As a reminder, you may submit your questions in the Q&A so they can be shared with the panelists during this session. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Dr. Dan Waters of the class of 1982, graduate of what was UMDNJ School of Osteopathic Medicine. I was a young internist and one of his first teachers. He was one of my first students. Very proud of him. He practiced cardiothoracic surgery for 30 years and was a hospital director of medical education for 2 decades. He holds a graduate certificate in narrative healthcare and a master's of arts in writing from Lenoir-Rhyne University in North Carolina. He retired from surgical practice in 2019 and remains on the teaching faculty in Medical Humanities at the Moines University's College of Osteopathic Medicine. He is the author of 4 novels, 2 books of surgical advice, multiple stories, essays, and opinion pieces, 2 poems, and an award-winning play. We are very proud of Dan. Dr. Samantha Plasner is a much more recent grad, and we're equally proud of her, a 2002 grad of SOM. We are happy that she joined our RowanSOM family as a faculty member in the Department of Family Medicine as an assistant clinical professor in 2015. She's very involved with medical education and teaches clinical skills for first-year medical students and sees patients in the department's Mount Laurel office. She's a great role model for our students. Dr. Plasner is pursuing her graduate certificate in narrative medicine from Columbia University. Also joining us on the call to support today's program is Dean Machichi, Assistant Dean for Student Programs and Alumni Engagement, Ms. Gail Foreman, Senior Director of Development for the Stratford campus, and Ms. Brittany Quintana, Program Coordinator for Student Affairs and Alumni Engagement. Dan and Samantha, thank you for your participation in the program, your support for RowanSOM, and as I said, as Dean, I am very proud of what both of you are doing and have done. I'm looking forward to your talk, and I invite Dan to begin the program at this time. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I'd like to thank the school and Dean Machichi for the invitation. Certainly, SOM has been very good to me over the years in terms of what it's allowed me to do. I do have to make special notice for Dr. Plasner, who was tapped on the shoulder at perhaps not the 11th hour, but certainly at the 10th hour to jump in and help with this presentation. So when I initially approached this, and I give a talk like this and have for a number of years now, it didn't really have the significance I think it has today. And, I think we are living as physicians of any ilk in a profession that takes us every month, every year, every decade, a little further away from dealing directly with our patients. Certainly in the era of the pandemic, that's true. And hopefully that'll be short-lived in the scheme of things, but it may also be the harbinger of things to come. So considering that we do live in a digital world, I mean, the digital world is providing this webinar at the moment. So how can we hold on to our humanity? And I think it's a challenge. And for doctors like Samantha, how do we tell the next generation? How do we teach the next generation of doctors how to hold on to their humanity? Because their world's going to be very different than when we graduated. Next slide, please. So the title, for those of you who are not of a certain age, comes from a Rod Stewart album from 1974 called "Every Picture Tells a Story, Don't It?" And you know, I just have used this because I have the album. Yes, I'm old enough to have albums, and I thought this was a great album. I thought the world actually came to an end the day Rod Stewart recorded Julie Andrews' "These Are a Few of My Favorite Things." I mean, if that wasn't a sign of the apocalypse, I don't know what was. But we don't have pictures anymore. Pictures are photographs. Now we have pixels. And so, next slide, please. I have a couple of disclosures, just as a matter of course. I'm currently a writing fellow for Doximity. I only bring this up because it does provide a small stipend at the conclusion of each fellowship year. I don't think it affects my ability to talk on this subject. And yes, I do appreciate the irony of giving a virtual presentation on a digital world. Next. You know, medicine for centuries has taken us a step back from our patients. You know, sometimes because of, you know, technology, other times because of necessity or safety. Initially, you know, protection from our patients, not getting what they have or not giving them what we have. Surgical antisepsis, you know, was an unheard of concept for the longest time. But it's always come at a price. And you know, perhaps like Shakespeare says, what's past is always prologue. You know, we all know the bird speak picture of the plague doctor carrying, you know, fragrant herbs in it to ward off the, you know, pervasive scent of death. But when you look at it today, is it really that much different from a fully gowned and gloved and protected PPE physician? And I think probably the answer is no. Both of them in their own ways are plague doctors, but it does separate us to a great degree from the patients that we're going to treat. Next. The other thing that separated us from our patients, taking us a step back, has always been sophistication. The stethoscope was invented to save physicians from having to place their ear on the bosom of society, ladies. And a rolled up piece of paper was sort of the first thing. And then, you know, it's just got more sophisticated since then. If you know today, you can get a sonogram or actually an echocardiogram transducer that will hook to your iPhone, and you can amuse yourself by doing your own 4-chamber echo. You know, the first two are pictures that are historical. The third one comes from Woody Allen's movie Zelig. But I believe, Tom, when you started, this is how we did bedside auscultation. The middle picture, someone told me, a female physician said clearly this was the first time a man ever listened to a woman. So, next. You know, if you stop and think about where we started, you know, we didn't have really a whole lot. You know, medieval wood cuttings and art. You know, I mean, think about it. You know, we had bodily fluids. You could swirl a flask of urine. You know, if you couldn't figure out what was wrong, you could let a little blood. You know, not very sophisticated. Next. One might consider crude, but medicine in its origin was at least always up close and personal. You know, these are woodcuts of medieval medicine. The first one, I believe the larger one to the left, may be the first hospital administrator talking to a physician, but this is only conjecture. But it was up close and personal, and you couldn't get away from the patients. You had to be right next to them. And those sort of things are starting to go away, not just because of the pandemic. It started with probably, well, we'll get to what it started with, but it really has to do with technology. Next. Things went along for a really long time. We used our ears, we used our eyes, we palpated, we listened, we did a bunch of other things. And then this happened. This is not one of the Smith brothers, although that's been said once or twice when I've given this talk. But this is Theodor Röntgen, and this is the famous picture of the first X-ray, if you will. The woman is his wife, and he took the first X-rays of his wife. That's her hand with the ring and the jewelry. So you can just imagine the conversation. Hi, honey, I invented something that's new, untested, and probably highly dangerous here. So say cheese. And he took the first X-ray pictures of his wife. Next. So we went from that to this. She does not have dextrocardia, but of course, in those days, they were not the PA projections we're looking at today. They're AP projections, and so things appear mirror imaged. So we got that. Next. But fortunately, I don't know if anybody's old enough to have read up growing comic books, but I desperately wanted to order these and was never allowed to. We never got to X-ray specs, which really would have made life a lot more interesting, whether you were a physician or not. Next. Or unfortunately, for half the population, we never really got to this. It's noticeable that apparently X-ray for women had nothing to do with visuals. It had to do with true intentions and avoiding, as the ad says, a future life of torment and pain. Not really a bad deal for a buck. So next. What do we have today? When I was on service on medicine and Tom Cavalieri and John Fitzharris were ordering tests, we had X-rays, and we had some thing that nobody really understood called ultrasound, but we weren't really sure what it did. There was this new thing called CAT scanning, and nobody knew what that did either. And now today, those things seem rudimentary. They seem almost primitive if you are training in today's, where you not only have angiography and X-ray, you have CT scanning, and then you have digital 3D reconstructions. It was miraculous the first time anybody saw a coronary artery. Now you can see inside of one and make judgments about what the obstructing plaque might be made of. Next. Finally, technology and situation has brought us to this, where it's very possible that you can imagine a future where we won't actually see patients in the sense that we believe. We will not be in the same room with them. We can text with them. They can take pictures of the little spot on their back that they want us to look at. They can do consultations. You can do anything, and we'll never have to be together. We may never have to share a common space anymore to see patients. Probably not going to happen, no longer out of the realm possible. Next. So everybody probably has seen Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. I would say today, if he were alive, what we now have is the Vitruvian scan. And, I just thought this was, really indicative of how far we've come. We almost don't see people as people. We see them as the sum of their scans, of their tests, of their lab results. And that's going to be a problem, I think, if we're not careful. So literally, next, we have come from Da Vinci to Da Vinci. And if you're not familiar with it, that is the Da Vinci robotic surgery system, from which you could, if you wanted to, operate on a patient in Europe sitting in New York City at the console. It's just a matter of how good your connection is. So I think there's probably a lot of serendipity that they decided to name it Da Vinci, and a little bit of humor. Next. So keeping a little bit with Leonardo, how are we going to remain connected? I mean, when we can operate on somebody from 5,000 miles away, when we can do consultations from our living room, when we can see patients in the ER on FaceTime, how do we remain connected? Next. Story. I think story is what's going to do it. In just a minute, I'm going to pass the baton to Samantha, who is, to my great delight, heavily involved in pursuing what people kind of scoffed at just 5 or 6 years ago, which is narrative medicine. And I'm not going to take her explanation away, but whether we're a foot away, whether 1,000 miles away, the one thing that will always connect us with the patient is the story. You can listen to their story, whether you are sitting where I am and they're sitting where you are, or whether they're sitting in the chair next to me. Next. So with no further ado, and again, thanks for stepping in at the last minute to help me out here. Samantha's going to talk to you about why story is important and how we can use it to stay connected.
Okay, thank you. Can you switch to the next slide, please? Okay. So as they alluded to, I kind of came in here at the last minute, but I'm happy to talk about narrative medicine. I've kind of given this presentation before, and I'm really interested and excited to share what narrative medicine is. The other times that I've given this conversation or started this conversation, I've kind of gone from a platform of assuming that most people haven't really heard of it, or maybe if you've heard of narrative medicine, I think a lot of physicians especially don't really know what it is. So that's what I'm going to provide you with, is a brief explanation of narrative medicine. So you haven't probably heard about it, or you don't really understand what it is because it hasn't been around for all that long. It was sort of the brainchild of a woman named Rita Sharon. She is an internist, and I believe she also has a PhD in English. She's out of Columbia University, and she was trying to figure out a way for her, in her own practice, to marry together the idea of storytelling and her clinical practice so that she could better understand her patients. So at least to hear her tell the story, she reached out to the English department and asked them to help her create a way to really pull the story out of her clinical encounters. And so that is what eventually led to the formation of narrative medicine, which combines the most important features of storytelling and clinical medicine. Next. So this is her official definition of narrative medicine. It's clinical medicine fortified by a knowledge and understanding of what to do with stories. And what Sharon's really tried to do is recognize that each patient has a story to tell you. And if you think about when you see a patient in your office setting, whatever kind of physician you are, they're all trying to tell you their story. So it might be the story of living with their chronic illness. So you're trying to find out, what's your blood sugar and are you taking your medication? The patient sitting across from you is often trying to tell you what it feels like to be a person doing their job and taking care of their family while they have diabetes. Some of their stories are really captivating, and I think we've all seen a patient who sort of stops you in your tracks with the story that they have to tell. But I think the vast majority of their stories, if we're not paying close attention, are kind of mundane, and they're, about the cold that they got last week. But they're clinical medicine plus the patient's story, and if we can recognize the importance of their story, we can help them in a more complete way. Next slide. So this book, if you haven't heard of it, it's a great book and you should read it, or at the very least listen to the audio book. It's a really easy listen as well. But it makes a really great point about why narrative in medicine makes sense. And I'm going to try to make that connection for you, which is the other reason I bring up the book, because I'm going to take one of their ideas and steal it and not make it my own, but share it with you. So the argument that the author makes in this book is that the very essence of what makes humans different from all other species is our ability to tell and receive a story. So the idea is not that we have language, because we're certainly not the only animals that have a spoken language. We all pretty widely recognize that, dolphins and whales and even a lot of little tiny insects have a spoken language that they're able to communicate with each other through. The book uses the example of monkeys. So, if we were to observe monkeys in a jungle, it is really obvious when one of the monkeys spots a predator, they can call out to the rest of their group, and you can see everybody kind of scurry away and take cover to protect themselves from the predator. But what the monkeys can't do is, after the threat is gone, they can't all get together and say, we're all really small and our predator is really big, and one-on-one, we could never take down the predator. But as a group, we could go hide, and next time we see that predator, if we all attack together, we can eliminate the threat. So monkeys can't do that, but human beings can, and we have done that for, thousands of years, millennia. And it's one of the reasons why humans have been able to survive and thrive. And there's all sorts of examples throughout history of human beings really being able to formulate and tell each other a story. And we see that in all different cultures with regards to burial rituals and the idea that we can imagine a future and we can work together to achieve it. It's certainly one of the things that allowed us to put a man on the moon, and will probably one day allow us to put a man or woman out onto Mars and hopefully beyond. So that's sort of the essence of what makes humans different from all other species. Next slide. This picture is not really critical to the story of narrative medicine, but I put it out here. It is included in the book that I just showed you the cover of, and it's amazing. So I love to share it with people, because if you're not familiar with it, I think it's worth taking a look at. This is a picture of a place called the Cave of Hands, which is an archaeological find from a cave in Argentina. And it dates back somewhere between 9,000 and 13,000 years. And if you look at it, you can see that they're almost hands that were printed in relief. So if you put your hand up against the wall and then spray painted over it, the image that it would create is essentially what these pictures are. So these hands date back from a 3,000-year period. And the true significance of it is unknown, but 13,000 years ago, human beings were leaving their impression and telling a story. People who have been to the cave say it almost looks like these hands are kind of reaching up to heaven. I think you can find a whole bunch of different explanations for the Cave of Hands, but to me, it's almost the equivalent of me writing on the wall of a cave, Samantha was here, 2020. So I think it just speaks to the inherent nature of our ability and our desire to tell our own story. And that's really what narrative medicine aims to help, not just physicians, but other clinicians, so nurse practitioners, nurses, social workers, lots of different people from all sorts of different allied health professions. It allows us to recognize the story that the patient is trying to tell us, amongst other things. Next slide. So narrative medicine allows us to do a whole bunch of different things. It allows us or helps us understand the patient within the context of the problem. It also really stresses the idea that not every patient comes to see you because they want you to fix them. So a lot of times people just want to be heard. And sometimes just listening and allowing them to share their story can be very therapeutic. And I think that's one other thing that narrative medicine can help us enable in our patients. And it's also just a really great way to help you shift your focus so that you can address the patient's concerns more effectively and, as a result, help them take better care of themselves and live their best lives. Next slide. So that sounds great, but how do we do that? Narrative medicine focuses on these three different components: attention, representation, and affiliation. And I'll just really briefly describe them to you because it can get kind of boring, a little bit dry, but attention is just what it sounds like. When we practice narrative medicine, we want to pay attention. So obviously pay attention to what the patient is saying, but narrative practice also involves paying attention to what the patient isn't saying. So, it's practice listening to people talk and listening to when they pause and where they pause in their sentences. And sometimes there's as much meaning in the silence as there is in the words that the patient chooses to use, but also paying attention to everything that's going on around the patient and all of the little things that they're not saying that they're trying to communicate to you. Representation is representing in some tangible way what the story of the clinical encounter was. So obviously we represent the patient encounter in our note. And I think just to kind of speak to what Dan was suggesting, we have these electronic medical records, and if you're not careful, it's really easy to create a 20-page note that really says very little about the patient and has, a lot of data in it, and it's hard to kind of weed through it to figure out what's happening. So one of the things that I try to do when I see a patient is include a little bit of my own personal narrative, because that's going to help me remember what my impression of the patient was at that particular time, and it's also going to help the next doctor. My group we have 5 doctors in our office, so I like to think that if somebody else sees the patient after me, they go back and read my note. So that's the obvious representation, but we also represent the experience of being a physician in a lot of different ways. So in narrative medicine, we practice a lot of reflective writing. People will say, well, I don't like to write. You don't have to be a good writer to have reflection be a really important and worthwhile part of your practice. And you can also, represent or reflect in conversation with other physicians or with other healthcare professionals, not necessarily about one specific patient, but just about the patient experience. And then some people will say, well, I don't really want to share that with anybody. You can reflect on your own. You can represent the encounters that you had, even as simply or as in short a period of time as turning off the radio when you're driving home from work and just really thinking about, what did I just do? Because we run through the day making a million decisions and coming in contact with lots of different patients, and sometimes just kind of decompressing and thinking about what it is you did, and did I have a positive impact on one person today? And that's all representation. And then affiliation is using all of that to create that strong bond with the patient and also to just appreciate all of the work that you do. Next slide. So it's really hard for a group setting, or, particularly awkward, I think, because I'm kind of talking to my computer here, to explain what narrative practice is. And if you've paid attention to narrative medicine, you've likely seen advertisements for narrative workshops for physicians, for CME credit, or just for practice. And a lot of what that involves is close reading or close looking or close listening. So narrative medicine can be worked on or achieved through a lot of different mediums. So a lot of it involves, really closely looking at a short poem or a paragraph. You'd be surprised at how long you can spend just sort of critically evaluating a couple of lines of a poem. Why are the lines broken up the way that they're broken up? What is the tempo? And we ask a lot of the questions we would ask of a good storyteller. So what do you hear? What do you see? How does it feel? We can do this with poems. We can do this with fiction. I've participated in narrative workshops involving memoir writing. That's a really good medium to use, but also popular songs or song lyrics, and clearly art. So that's why you're looking at a picture. This is titled Bathsheba at Her Bath. It's a Rembrandt, and I believe the original is hanging in the Louvre. I had the really great privilege of taking a group of medical students 2 or 3 years ago to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, where they actually run a program for local medical schools on art in medicine. And they take the students through this 4-week curriculum of showing them how close observation can give you a lot of information without ever speaking. So this painting is a way for me to just give you a taste of what narrative practice can look like. And if anybody is involved in art history in any way, forgive me, because I'm a very admitted amateur, but I'm going to give this just a very brief shot. So if you're looking at a picture like this with a group and narrative, we, usually start with the background and what does it feel like? And so somebody might say, well, it feels really dark and it kind of feels cold to me. But if you look a little bit closer to the front of the picture, you might notice there's like a lot of like soft looking linens and towels. So, and clearly this woman is not wearing any clothing. So somebody else might say, well, it kind of feels warm to me. We look at the way the woman is positioned and where she's looking, how does it feel? To me, it feels like she's not looking at us. So we're clearly not her audience and she's not engaging with the viewer. It seems like a really personal moment. She's kind of positioned away from us. She's obviously comfortable not being dressed in front of the woman that's helping her with her bath, and she almost doesn't look like she's even looking at that woman. So it feels like a really private moment. And then particularly helpful, especially with the medical students who you're trying to get to buy into this, we can just look at her body. And if you look at her abdomen, it kind of looks a little bit full. Speculation is that the model for this picture was actually Rembrandt's partner. And based on the dates, it's assumed that she was pregnant at this time with his child. So you can see that her abdomen looks like it's a little gravid, perhaps. If we point out that left hand, it kind of looks a little distorted and maybe a little large. So we could have a conversation with the narrative group about, well, does this represent a medical condition? Is this maybe acromegaly or something? And, I think if you look at a lot of Rembrandt's paintings, he's just not great at painting hands. Hands are really tricky to draw and paint, and he misrepresents a lot of hands. And if you look at the lower half of the arm, it's kind of held at a funny angle. It looks like a little bit out of proportion with the upper arm. And that probably doesn't represent anything pathologic. It's probably just Rembrandt's portrayal of the arm. But that really starts to pull the medical students, especially in, who aren't necessarily sold on why they've traveled across the bridge to Philadelphia to do art and medicine. But that starts to pull them in, and it gives all of us a sense of appreciation for really closely observing. And then I'll just, before we switch to the next slide, just really quickly, if you were to take a close enough look at this, you'd probably notice, if you haven't already, that the left breast looks a little distorted. If you look at the history of this photo or this painting, there's been some discussion about what that represents, and that probably is architecturally what Rembrandt saw when he was looking at the left breast. Could it have been a breast mass? Obviously, people got breast cancer in the 15 and 1600s. If this is in fact his partner, she lives for another 15 or 20 years after this painting was finished, so it's unlikely that that represents a breast cancer, but it certainly could be a breast mass of some sort, or a lipoma, or mastitis if she is pregnant. So those are all just interesting things that you can get from looking at one painting. And when I say that, somebody with a lot of knowledge and a little bit of experience facilitating narrative medicine can spend an hour with a small group on one picture like this. And I think everybody walks away from it feeling like they've really gotten a lot out of it. So hopefully that helps to explain a little bit about what narrative practice can be. Next slide. And the other thing that narrative medicine does, yeah, it's great, like I'm going to connect better with my patients, but it's also got something in it for you. I think we all kind of consider ourselves good communicators and we try hard to take care of patients, but I think it is easy in this world, especially, to kind of lose track of what it is that you're doing and why you like to do it. I am fortunate because I get to spend my time with first-year medical students who are thoroughly excited by everything. So you just have a first-year medical student with you in your office for a couple of hours, and they're excited about blood pressure, and they're excited to use the glucometer, and they think everything that you do is really cool, and that's really refreshing, and it reminds you of how much you love doing your job, but not everybody has a medical student at their side. Narrative medicine is a really great way to reconnect you with what it is that you love about your job. Next slide. So narrative is for you. The chair of my department said, I can see why narrative medicine would be something that you or some people would be interested in. And I like to correct him and say, no, everybody should be interested in narrative, because hearing that story and connecting with it is not just good for the patient, it's also good for you as the physician. It obviously allows you to describe your patient's experiences in detail. It allows you to observe and reflect on and use that information to inform your future practice. But it also allows you to really validate your own experiences. So this is obviously not a conversation about depression or burnout, but I think it's pretty well established that physicians are just not really good at addressing their own mental health. I would venture to guess, just based on statistics, probably amongst us, almost every one of us knows somebody who is suffering from depression, who is a physician, or who has unfortunately tried to or been successful at taking their own life. I can name 2 people in my postgraduate training program that unfortunately committed suicide. And I think part of that is that we spend all day asking people what's wrong and trying to fix other people's problems, and never really acknowledging the fact that sometimes that impacts you as well. And I do think that focusing on the story and practicing narrative medicine can help really make tangible the experiences that you as a physician might have, which on any given day might be really stressful or might be really a large burden to carry. That's all I have to say. I'm going to pass it back to Dan, I think.
Presentation. It just is one of those serendipitous events that the person tapped to, help with this presentation has, really the same approach and the same experience I did. When I liked my narrative, my grad school experience in narrative medicine so much, I just kept going, to finish the master's degree, primarily because I found it really helped me. I was at the end of my career, and starting to get that part, like in the charcoal fire, where you really just wonder how much glow you got left. And it kept me very balanced for a good 5 or 6 years at the end of my practice. So the fact that Samantha's studying it right now, and I had gone through it, I think is just people look at it kind of funny, like, I don't have time to listen to the story, it's like, but that's not really it. I mean, once you start to realize the nuance of every story, it's a hedge against burnout. It makes you a better doctor. It makes you feel better about being a doctor. And as far as living in the digital world, it doesn't matter. Time, distance, layers of PPE. The stories we have will always connect us. And I love this slide because, obviously it's a riff on Da Vinci's, with sterile gloves on, but that's the whole point. Stories will always connect us. Next. So how do we become better story listeners? I think Samantha did a great job. I mean, we have to become, our job is not to just, become algorithm experts. We're not just looking at lab tests and scan results and this and that. If we lose the ability to listen to the story, to listen to what the patient's telling us, we have lost a lot. So who teaches us that? They don't really teach in college. They don't really teach in medical school unless you've got Samantha. So how do we become better story listeners? Next. Become better story readers, become better storytellers. I love teaching. I teach a course in Medical Humanities, and I just love throwing up pictures of popular culture because, at my age, I was 65 in May. I know who all these people are, but a lot of my students, they thought the person on the left was maybe, Albert Einstein. Not. It's Mark Twain, the greatest storyteller of his century, and Stephen King, who even now is somebody's like, yeah, I think I saw a movie about him once, and but you by studying, by reading storytellers, which we can do by next reading. Okay, Samantha alluded to it. The book she outlined, it's a great book. It really is. It is really worth the time. We're from literally different generations and graduation. 20 years separates us from the time we graduated medical school. But these are the books that either I picked up or came across my desk when I was studying narrative healthcare and writing. The House of God. I think everybody should read The House of God. My medical students were like, man, they kind of slug through the first few chapters. It's dated, it's sexist, but it's still probably the funniest and truest book about medical training ever written. Richard Seltzer, who's passed away, was probably decades ahead of his time in founding some of the best stories you'll ever read about medicine. And he was a surgeon, but he writes about a lot of other things. And the thing about it is, it's not just a book about one thing. It's a book with multiple stories. Some are humorous, some are poignant, some are heartbreaking. If you had to read one Richard Seltzer book, I would read Mortal Lessons. Frankenstein. Why would anybody read Frankenstein? Well, 80% of people think Frankenstein was the monster and not the doctor. And if you're going to read Frankenstein, read this one, the 1818 version by Mary Shelley, which Percy did not edit. He, of course, because he was a guy, he thought he could make it better. But she wrote this. This is the unabridged version. You can see to get it published, she couldn't even put her name on it. But if you really read Frankenstein, and it is really a pretty good read, it's a book about a doctor-patient relationship gone, what I used to say, is monstrously wrong. But it is at heart a book about a doctor-patient relationship and, what it is to take care of somebody, what it is to be responsible. A Christmas Carol. You don't want to read it now. It's the middle of August. But, somewhere after Thanksgiving, read A Christmas Carol. If there's one line in literature that defines medicine, it's mankind was my business. I mean, is there anything more succinct? Mankind is our business. It's not really a book about Christmas. It's not really a book about religion. It's a book about what is our responsibility, who are we, and how do we take care. And then I love The English Patient. You can see the movie. It's a great movie. It's a very good adaptation. But I don't know that there's a single book better than The English Patient that says more about not just caretaking, but story. The two main themes in the book are the power of story, because he tells a story the whole time, and one person caring for another. Next. And then you got to write. I mean, you don't have to be a writer to write. It's like, well, I can't write. I'm not any good at it. Nobody ever has to read it. Writing is liberating. Writing is therapeutic. Writing can save you from burnout. Writing is powerful, whether you are a first-year medical student or somebody who's done. Sitting up in John F. Kennedy in Stratford one night, the first piece I ever really had published was after I'd gotten back from Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and I was so struck by the intensive care unit, I wrote a story about it, and I kind of sheepishly showed it to a pediatrician who was feared at the time by everyone. I won't mention his name, and he was one of the best teachers we ever had at Rowan. But he was pretty much feared, and I asked him if he would read it. And it was about 11 o'clock up in the nursery, and I didn't know what he was going to do. And he finished it. He took his glasses off, and he wiped tears away. And I thought, whoa, writing, you can make a difference with writing. And you don't have to make it for anybody else. You can make it for yourself. And whether anybody reads it or not, whether it publishes or not, it is liberating. So I can't really, I don't want to take up too much more time we have for questions, but, Samantha just very succinctly discussed narrative medicine, and you don't have to get a grad certificate in it. You don't have to get a master's in it like we did or will be doing. Go to a weekend workshop. They are now all over the place. And in a weekend, you can get enough to make it enjoyable for yourself, to change the way you sit down and listen to a patient, to maybe go home and write a little something about a case that's bothering you. So, you want to stay human, you want to stay connected, read, write, and learn how to listen to the story. Next. Thank you. So there's Rod Stewart in a digital world. And anybody has questions, I just leave this in the slides. Don't hesitate. You can email me. As I say, being retired means never having to say you're busy. So I'll turn it back to our moderator at this point.
Well, thank you both, Dr. Plasner and Dr. Waters, for a wonderful presentation. And we really appreciate your insight and knowledge on this topic. So attendees, if you do have any questions, please, you can type them into the Q&A section and we can share them with Dr. Waters and Dr. Plasner. But I do have a couple questions to start off with. So how do you realistically incorporate narrative medicine into a busy office?
You know, my practice was a little different. I didn't have a constant stream of office patients, but I had to do consultations. I had to see post-ops, and often we were running behind. But I teach the medical students, when you walk in the room, sit down, look the patient in the eye, engage them, and even if you only have 5 minutes, if you in 5 minutes you can basically do all the things that Samantha outlined. You don't need an hour to practice narrative medicine. And since I don't have a busy office practice, and I'm sure Samantha does, I'm going to let her answer to see what she thinks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's incorporated in everything that you do, just really always tell the students, and certainly in the coursework that I've done, you sit down and look at the patient, don't put your hands on the keyboard, just take a breath and say, how are you? And let the patient just start talking. A lot of times you want to sort of interrogate to get all the key features you need out of them. But if you just let them talk for a couple of minutes, you're liable to hear a lot of what you want, and they're getting to say what they need to say. And in the course of a really busy day, if I have 15 minutes with a patient and the student takes 10 of them, that really doesn't leave me much more than the 5 minutes. And so it's 5 minutes, 5 times a year over the course of 10 or 15 years, and you really get to know the person. And they really appreciate that connection, which you kind of form with them over this journey that you take together.
And I think the other thing, is that what are the 2 most common complaints patients have about their physician? Didn't listen, didn't care. Why do you think they're the 2 most common? Because they are the same thing. People think if you don't listen to them, you don't care. And so listening is, it should be the first skill we teach, not the last.
Other open-ended questions are best to elicit responses with the most worthwhile information.
The first part of that was muted, so I apologize, I didn't hear it.
Oh, I'm sorry. What other open-ended questions, aside from how are you, are best to elicit responses with the most worthwhile information?
Take it, Samantha.
Okay, I think how do you feel? A lot of times patients, the first thing they tell you is, how something didn't go right. So how does that make you feel? Like I couldn't get that medication, my pharmacy, my insurance plan won't let me get it. How do you feel about that? They really aren't necessarily blaming you for not being able to get the MRI or for having trouble scheduling or having trouble getting through on the phone. They just want to validate their experience. So how do you feel about that is a really great question to ask. And sometimes the silence, if the patient seems like they have something to say, but they're not saying it, just sit there quietly. And it's just human nature that we are uncomfortable in silence. So the patient will usually start talking. You don't have to give them a lot of prodding or promoting.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, is that open-ended is open-ended, but sometimes the thing that worked best for me was, I would say, well, what's the worst thing about this? It says here you came in because you had this. What really is bothering you? Why would you come all the way here to see me for this? And if it's like, well, doc, I can't do this, and it just opens that door a little bit, and then you can continue to guide the interview, but establishing that you are listening to what's important to them changes the tenor and the tone of the entire visit. I mean, it just absolutely does. I mean, if you walk in the door with a chart in your hand and say, well, I see you got chest pain, we're going to need to do an angiogram, and, it's probably nothing, but we'll do a scan, I mean, again, patients are not the sum of their lab tests. And just by engaging them, trying to get a personal answer, what about this bothers you the most? What does it do to your life? You got to be prepared, if they launch in with, something that's going to take 2 hours, you have to steer it back, but you can do that. And part of the narrative process is not just sitting there like a tape recorder listening. Part of it is learning how to guide the patient's narrative to best get across what they want to get across.
So one of our attendees asks, did Dan ever consider doing a podcast of reading, then offering insight? And he also says, hey, if you have time, I worked as the librarian for Rita Sharon 25 years ago, and I met Richard Selzer.
Oh my God. Well, she got me on 2 counts there. So, I'm showing my age. I wouldn't. I mean, I know what podcasts are. I listen to podcasts. I would have no idea how to approach saying, saying, hey, I want to do a podcast. You got to say, hey, I want to play on the PGA Tour, get in line, buddy. So, I would love to. When I talk at narrative meetings like the Examine Lice Conference at Iowa, I did a whole hour reading just a few things that I'd written and then had been published over the years, and then talked about how they came about and what therapeutic benefit I got out of it and where that particular piece of writing came from. And it can get kind of emotional. So yes, if anyone younger than I ever wants me to do a podcast, just let me know and tell me how to do it, and I'll be there in a hurry.
So another question, how do we best overcome stereotyping by using narrative medicine?
I think it's a really good question. It's a really insightful question. If you practice narrative, you won't be able to stereotype somebody. That's the whole point. And one of the things I teach my students, and I imagine, Samantha may do the same thing, is I teach them not to use the labels. Oh, it's frequent flyer. Oh, this person's crazy. Oh, this is a chronic, oh, I already know what this is before I walk in the room. Yes, it's tough. And yes, a lot of times that's true. But if you can teach somebody just that quick and dirty narrative approach, it forces you not to stereotype them. It forces you to listen. And, because, you have to get rid of confirmational bias. If the nurse in the hallway says, oh, it's frequent flyer, you're going to love this one. When you walk in the room, you're preconditioned. With a little bit of narrative training and background, you can shed that and walk in and say, oh, okay, fine, and sometimes you'll uncover something, horrendous, and you would have been steered away from it right from the get-go.
Dr. Plasner, did you want to respond as well?
No, I think that was a really great answer to that question. Just trying to look at the person in front of you and see what's there. Because oftentimes, they're not there to ruin your day or to, make your schedule run behind. They have a problem, and they're there for you to help them. So, I think that was a great answer, Dan.
And in response to what you were saying with the nurse making a comment before you walk in the door, so how do you then train the practice, individuals working within the practice in this same area?
That's a bigger challenge. As Samantha alluded to, narrative medicine is new enough. You got to get the docs first, and then the docs need to proselytize. The docs need to be the disciples, I offered to teach, a once a month course at the nursing school in town. Not interested, I mean, it's just people, they just look at it and like, you're in medicine. We don't have time for that. Hocus pocus, touchy feely, artsy craftsy. I mean, it's like Bob Ross or something, and I love Bob Ross, but people, they don't understand. It's a clinical skill, and it should be taught the same way you teach cardiac auscultation.
Another question. Thank you. How do you think we can best accomplish making sure patients feel heard in the age of telemedicine?
One more time, it was a little garbled.
Sure. How do you think we can best accomplish making sure patients feel heard in the age of telemedicine?
Go, Samantha.
Well, I think it's really not much different than seeing them in person. I spent the last 5 months sitting right at this desk talking to patients all day long. And the talking part is no different. Once you kind of get used to the technology and the fact that if I'm making eye contact with you, I can't be looking at you on my screen. So once you get past that, it's the same as having a conversation. Really, the challenge for me was not being able to touch the patient, put my hands on them and use my stethoscope and trying to get creative to examine them. But I felt like the connection was still there. And in a lot of ways, people were much more appreciative of the conversation because we really just weren't going out and talking to a lot of different people. And in some ways, it kind of gave me a little window into some of my chronic patients' everyday lives. I was really careful not to bring up the background, but a lot of people wanted to just kind of, as we were, show me their pets and show me a picture that they painted and introduce me to family members that wouldn't ordinarily come along with them. So I think in some ways, it almost seems against what you would think, but I think in some ways it really helped forge some of those connections.
Yeah, and that's such a perfect answer in essence, because the whole goal of narrative, the whole goal of the story is to be able to see the patient in context, and the office changes that. The office, you see them in the context of the office, you see them in the context of what the nurse may have said to you. Again, counterintuitive, telemedicine takes us further away, but yet, as you just said, it allows us to see the patient in the fullest context of what's around them. And, there's nothing really wrong with the screen and the cameras and everything, because 90% of verbal communication is body language, facial expression, and tone of voice. And none of those things are lost in translation here. So, if you're not paying attention, if you're looking at your phone, if you're messing with the dog or getting the kids, people are going to know. The camera, it sees everything.
I think Dean has a question for the panelists as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dan and Samantha. I just had a question. Just listening here, I'm very much reminded how this topic really ties in a big way to sort of what Gail and I do, because advancement and meeting with donors is very much about knowing their story. And on the practical level, though, we can go and meet with a donor and learn about them and their story, and spend 2 hours with them to do that. We tell our students on the alumni phonathons to keep the caller on the line, because you're forming a relationship. But how do you balance that in an office, right? So you have a person who comes in who does want to talk and tell you their story, who might take 25, 30 minutes, but your chair wants you to see 6 patients an hour and your insurance bills are down. So how do you balance the practical part?
Well, I spent my entire career battling with administrators, because everybody needs a windmill to tilt that a little bit, but again, you cannot. Medicine is not a spreadsheet. And they so often want to manage by spreadsheet, and they want patient satisfaction. If you want patient satisfaction, you need to be able to listen to them. Where narrative would have its, and all the MBAs love to hear return on investment. Where narrative has its return on investment is a good narrative practitioner can get what they need, can engage the patient in 5 or 6 minutes and get the story that they need and make the patient feel heard, just by guiding the interview, by bringing them back in every couple of seconds here and there. You may not have all that time, but it doesn't mean that you can't listen. And a happy patient is always a better patient.
Thank you so much. And I think that is it for our questions this evening. Thank you both. I'll leave it for Dean to continue.
So I do want to try and live up to our promise to do these programs in an echo. Thank you both for doing this tonight. I want to thank everyone who attended the meeting. We hope it was beneficial for you. I know it was for me, and helped to enhance physician-patient experience, as well as really any virtual encounter, because I think what you taught us today can be applied to life. I will just tell everyone that we did record the session. It will be available on the RowanSOM Alumni page, probably within the next week. Very special thank you to Dr. Waters, Dr. Plasner, for your time, for sharing your wisdom on this important topic. Also like to thank Ms. Gail Foreman, really, who organized today's event, Ms. Brittany Quintana, and Ms. Nora Casper for their support. I want to mention, everyone, that we have our next webinar in September, Wednesday, September 30th, when we'll be discussing the importance of vaccines, development of new vaccines, and patient and physician conversations about vaccines for all ages in the age of COVID. Program panel will feature 3 SOM alumnus, Dr. Gina Marie Foglia, Dr. Kevin Overbeck, and Dr. Rebecca Miller, to cover this topic from all angles, and also discuss the prospects for a COVID-19 vaccine. So I also want to thank Dr. Valeri for joining us earlier and kicking off the program, and everyone for participating and supporting this series. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful evening.
Thanks for having me. Samantha, thanks again for jumping in. Great job.
No problem. Take care.
Yep. Good night.